Okay, we're going to get started. This is very loud.
Is it that one's loud? Do you want to do this one?
No, that's fine. I want to be with the people. Yeah. So, hello, welcome, welcome, welcome. I am Hilton Kelly, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Education. And if anybody has a problem with that, Jen Collins, blame Jen Collins because she hired me. Stand up, Jen. Jen Collins is the, um, yes. Oh, they're clapping. That means I'm doing a good job. But yeah, so she hired me and then she left. So that was interesting. Um, it's great to see so many people from UW Platteville, the city of Platteville and beyond. Um, I grew up in rural eastern North Carolina, right? So you have dairy farms. That's all I can tell you have. But I was surrounded by tobacco and cotton fields, right? Just outside my window growing up. So rural communities I'm pretty familiar with. I attended rural schools from kindergarten until 12th grade. After college, I taught in two rural schools in Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. What's really interesting, Charlotte-Meck, you think of Charlotte being metropolitan, urban space, but there are a lot of rural schools there. So it's interesting how we focus on urban education rather than rural, and so I'm excited to see the focus on rural education. So I'm feeling at home. One of the things I wasn't going to tell this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So one of the things I remember about teaching in rural North Carolina, I was teaching 8th grade, and I'm still trying to get over that. That was a lot. And I remember walking into my classroom one day, and 8th graders, they're always up to something. And I knew something was going on. I walked into the room, they were supposed to be doing morning work. Those of you who taught, you give them morning work so you can go do other things. And I went and I was like, what is going on? So somebody's uncle or somebody had killed a hog the day before, and they had these greasy skins, hog skins, all over the classroom, passing them around. I was like, what, you country bumpkin, So anyway, but that was my experience. And I can tell you, they were very tasty. But I just remember that there was something different about this rural community and this rural school, and you had to those of you who are student teaching now, you got to get into the community and just accept it and just pick up the bag of skins, greasy skins, and eat them with the kids, which is what I ended up doing. What I want to do is just get a sense of who's in the room. So when I call your group or organization, please stand and remain standing. And I want everybody to kind of look around to see who's here. So students who are majoring in elementary education, completing an emphasis in secondary education, or simply taking an education class this semester at UW Platteville, please stand and remain standing. This is really good. You're clearly offering extra credit. No, keep standing. This is wonderful to see students coming who have an interest in rural education. Keep standing. Principals, superintendents, and other local education authorities. Please take a look at them. These are the people who are going to hire you. Our colleagues in rural education across the state and nation. Okay. Faculty and staff in the College of Liberal Arts and Education, EMS or BILSA. Okay. Guests from the Thompson Center. Okay. And I should say, if you are able to stand. Guests from the, employees at the university. Our illustrious panelists. Okay, who's still sitting? So let's say our colleagues from the Platteville Public School System. Okay, we have one more, tell me. CESA 3, our CESA 3 partners, please stand. We have students from China, TESOL program. We have a Master's of Education in TESOL. Please stand. We have a student behind you. Who are you? And yeah. So anyway, so on behalf of Chancellor Ivetovich, Interim Provost Weber, and me, you are welcome.
Hello, everyone. I have a couple remarks too, and I'm going to speak from this microphone because I remembered this is the one that is connected to our speaker on Zoom. My name is Lindsay Hollingsworth. I am a professor in the School of Ed and one of the co-chairs of this conference, and I really want to thank you for joining us tonight. I have a couple thank yous and an introduction I'd like to offer. This is our second annual Rurally Responsive Education Conference, and it was made possible by the support of many committed partners. First, we're grateful for the Thompson Center for sponsoring the conference for the last 2 years in partnership with the School of Ed at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. They work to further these goals by offering public events such as this, funding research and scholarships, honoring exemplary public leaders with distinguished public leadership awards, and conducting other activities across UW campuses. All of these events are free and open to the public. For more information on their upcoming events, grant opportunities, or other aspects of the center, please visit the Thompson Center website. I'd also like to thank the Thompson Center staff who were not able to be here tonight, but Alex, Ruth, and Lily, thank you for your support. I'd also like to thank individuals on campus that made this event possible. Thank you to our conference committee members, and I'd also like to invite them to stand up. My co-chair, Dr. Doug Adams. Thank you. Jenny McLean was incredibly helpful getting all the logistics scheduled. She's outside at our registration table, so thank you to Jenny. Mary Fisher helped me so much with contracts. Thank you, Mary. And Carrie Van Halgren, our assistant dean, wasn't able to be here tonight, but also was incredibly helpful. I'd also like to thank the Media Technology Services for all the support setting this up, and our dining and catering staff for the meal. It is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Ben Winchester. Unfortunately, the unpredictable Minnesota weather prevented Ben from joining us in person, but you can see his smiling face. He is here with us virtually. Ben has been working both in and for small towns in the Midwest for over 25 years. He lives in St. Cloud, Minnesota with his wife and their 2 children. Ben is trained as a rural sociologist and works for the University of Minnesota Extension. He conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic topics surrounding a theme of rewriting the rural narrative. He recently received the International Rural Renewal Research Prize in 2021 for his work. Winchester received his Bachelor's of Arts in Mathematics and Statistics from the University of Minnesota Morris and a master's degree in rural sociology from the University of Missouri-Columbia. He was a founding employee for the Center of Small Towns, an outreach program at the University of Minnesota. Morris specializes in community development, demographic analysis, data visualization, and moving communities away from anecdata. Please join me in welcoming Ben.
Hi, everybody. Quick mic check, thumbs up if you can hear me tonight. Hi. Oh, good. Good to see you all. I apologize. We ended up with like 16 inches of snow after we had a total of 3 the whole year. So, hello. And I'm I'm really happy to have the AV folks be able to help out here and really make this work. And really just appreciate your service to your communities and really to your passion for this topic tonight. So my background is I'm a math and stats geek. I love data, but most people don't. So hopefully all the data you see today will be consumable and understandable. And my own story is I grew up in the town of Winona. So I was actually like southwestern or southeastern Minnesota, western Wisconsin was kind of my stomping ground, La Crosse, Alaska, Fountain City, all that whole area there. And I used to think Winona was a small town, like I was going to go to the big city, right? Minneapolis or St. Paul and go to school. But then I went to school in Morris, Minnesota, which is a town of 5,000 people. So it was smaller. And I was like, oh, this is like a small town. But then I realized that Morris, with those 5,000 people, that's still bigger than 85% of the cities in the country. Like a majority of the cities we have in this country are super small. And so I really realized it was easy for me to get involved in like the Eagles and the Red Cross, and I loved it. Meanwhile, I watched like all my student friends when they graduate just bolt from Minneapolis, St. Paul. Like there was no even thinking twice about like staying. So I ended up wanting to stay. I wrote grants for some faculty and wrote myself into the grants so I could stay. And then one day, Roger McCannon, who was the head of continuing education in Morris, called and said, hey, Ben, we're going to start this organization called the Center for Small Towns. Would you be interested in being the first employee? And I was like, right on, because I wanted to stay. And I was a bar manager at the Eagles at the time, which wasn't my like career path I expected to be on, but I was a board member and our manager left and I was trying to make it work or whatever. So anyway, I got this job and I started to travel around Minnesota and really hear about like what was going on in small towns. And it was here I first started to realize that there's a common narrative that's being told about our small towns and rural places that's terrible. A lot of times this narrative is based upon things that happened like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and we're hanging on to it like it was yesterday. But meanwhile, all these towns I went to and I'm talking to the people in these towns, they're like optimistic and hopeful and passionate and like love their towns. And I could not like, it's dissonance, right? Like, oh man, I thought you were all dying here. I thought all these towns were dying, right? What's going on here? So anyway, I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint, but you're going to still see my face. So hopefully this will be kind of different and fun for you, I guess. Not fun, but I mean fun in a data sense. So really, you'll see the subtitle here to Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. Again, I'm a data geek. I love the data side of this. So we do talk about this narrative that even early in my career, I was like reading books and journal articles, right? I was in university. I was trying to read about what rural was happening. And again, like all the books and the journal articles I read were terrible. It's about all the terrible things that happen to our towns. And like you even see headlines like this today, like people keep leaving rural America, or there's one from breadbasket to basket case. Like you couldn't have written a more disrespectful headline if you tried. Like I'm sure they don't have mental health professionals like saying, oh yeah, that sounds good. Like that's terrible. So anyway, there's also a book called Hollowing Out the Middle, and that's about the rural brain drain. And that, if you don't know, is when your 18-year-olds from our small towns, not just our small towns, but any town, leave after they graduate. And it's called the brain drain. And it's like, well, you know, let them go, I guess. I mean, what are you going to do? Tell your 18-year-olds to stay? Like, you want to build more resentment in your 18-year-olds? Like, tell them what to do. Tell them they can't leave town, right? So anyway, the implication here in this book, though, is the rural brain drain and what it means for America. But what's the title? It's Hollowing Out the Middle. And the implication here is that when our kids leave, i.e. our 18-year-old high school graduates leave, there's nobody left and our towns are being hollowed out. It's like, well, all right, let's look at this a little bit more deeply. So there is a narrative out there, and we're not going to get into like tons of detail here. And I'm going to talk fast a bit, just so you know. I feel like Smokey and the Bandit, like we've got a long way to go in a short time to get there. Like there's a ton of stuff I want to go over with you all today. And because of just my limited time here with you all, I feel like I really want to share as much as I can. But just so you know, we are following up an opportunity for you to participate virtually on April 12th, just a lunchtime webinar. If you want to come and talk about any of what you hear today, you're more than welcome to come. You'll hear about more about later. So there is a narrative and that there's a brain drain. True, but it's not just a rural trend that we lose our 18-year-olds. That happens in the metro too, right? We live in the middle of nowhere. Like, that doesn't sound really good. Like that's commonly used as a, where do you live? In the middle of nowhere. or a sleepy town that, or everybody knows one another. Like Kellogg Foundation will tell you, whenever you see like quotes like this in a newspaper article, that's not the sign of a reporter that's done their job. That's a sign of a lazy reporter or people just working upon stereotypes as to what they believe is happening in this town. So you do see like a sleepy town that was woken up by the fill in the blank tornado or whatever it is, right? But the idea here is everybody's sleepy. Like, give me a break. I mean, all of this is not good. Nobody locks their doors. You do. No, everybody knows one another. You don't. Like, come on. The lucky few escape. We have all of these kind of narratives that are in our back pocket to talk about, like, our best days are behind us. Nobody wants to live here. The lucky few escape. All of this. So, to introduce a term to you called anecdata. Anecdata is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, when in fact it's just based on what somebody thinks is true. Like you can't live in the world of anecdotes, right? And that's where that anic comes from, right? If you have three people sitting around your cafe talking about how much they hate your town, that's not data. That's not a large trend. That's like 3 points of data, and don't use those anecdotes as a paintbrush for your broader trends. So with that, everything you hear tonight will be consumable and understandable, hopefully, and it will also have a citation behind it. So either like journal articles or books or things like that. And I'm really lucky to have a job in extension because I'm able to kind of consume a lot of this content and hopefully make it consumable for the people on the ground and in the decision making. So you'll see everything you'll hear tonight will be kind of geared toward like local community decision makers, school boards, EDA, city councils, those types of groups at the local level. They're really my bread and butter in terms of what I look at. So what has happened since the early 1900s? We have gone through negative changes in our rural communities. The early 1900s, the mechanization of agriculture alone reduced the number of farm workers by 40 and up to 60% in some places. Your rural populations did decline. And at the very same time, we introduced roads and transportation systems. So now we went from literally every town was kind of fending for itself to now having these great interactions between our towns. And there was kind of a race in the early 1900s to be the place that everybody came to, the one-stop shop. Well, not everybody won, and you ended up with lots of regional centers across the way, but you also have lots of communities that struggled out of this. And then by the time we hit the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we have restructuring happen. And I say Main Street restructuring, but this is a very kind economist way of saying businesses closed. So again, like here's a sleepy eye, Minnesota. I think this is that idyllic view of what people see in a small town or expect to see. Like, oh, there's cars everywhere and there's stores and there's people walking up and down the streets. Like, I lived in Hancock for many years until we moved to St. Cloud here. And it didn't look like that during the day, especially not today, because many of our businesses are actually relocated out or they're closed up. So you ended up closing up stores like grocery stores, hardware stores, apothecaries. You couldn't have like 3 gas stations in town. Now you're down to 1. And we tend to like believe we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Like, I should have shopped here more. But I want to remind you that these businesses are not just closing in one single town. This is called globalization that impacts like all of our communities. It impacts generally the same. But meanwhile, you look in the articles or how the community reflections at the time, and it's like, oh, I should have shopped here more. Well, that's not going to save you. Like a lot of times, these economic restructurings are happening at a level that you don't have control over necessarily. So I'll just remind you that every time there's a hardware store or grocery store that closes in a very small town, there's one that closes in Madison too, but you never hear of that because there's 3 to 5 other options that you can go to. But you close a grocery store in your small town, it's probably your only one. And now you have to drive past that every day. And you tend to think it's one more nail in the coffin for our community. And then in the 80s, we started to have more school consolidations. You guys did this too at the time, Minnesota. I didn't have the numbers on Wisconsin, but the number of districts went down by about 20%, 25% in some places, just because, and we used to have a lot of speculation at the time about school enrollments were going down because of open enrollment or, private schools or all of this stuff. And really the number one predictor of that is the birth rate. Like when your outgoing class is 20 and your incoming class is 12, like that -8 persists now over time through your total enrollments. So we did have a lot of schools that struggled, and we would close schools sometimes where you used to have a full K-12 in your community, but now you got the elementary school and some other town got the high school, and you're like shuttling kids between the two. Or sometimes, we did this a bunch of times too, is you closed all the schools and you built one in the middle of the countryside. So again, there's a lot of hand wringing around this, but this is actually school consolidations. This is actually something you have control over. You could actually, encourage that birth rate by having like pro fertility days and starting to like bump up those school enrollments for kindergarten and first grade. But anyway, there's some actual community strategies out of this sometimes you could have. But meanwhile, a lot of times this narrative is based upon where we have been. And today, it's just an idyllic view of what we think we should find. But I'll say the number one rural ideal out there is around agriculture, and that rural is agriculture. And it's the number one kind of fight I have, which is that I am a non-agricultural rural sociologist. 95% of rural people are not engaged in agriculture or even a related field to agriculture in that way. 95%. The top industries in rural America are education and health services by far. They make up a third of all of our jobs. You're in that. It's the caring economy, I'll call it, right? Caring for our people, it's caring for our kids, caring for our health, all of that. So really, just trying to get over these stereotypes of what rural is the biggest hurdle. So and we'll talk about the economic piece of this in just a little bit, but I did this study that looked at Kellogg, or the McKnight Foundation here in Minnesota, wanted to know, like, how do the media portray rural in Minnesota? So we looked at the metropolitan media and how did they portray it, and what type of stereotypes they had, and they were there and whatnot. And you want to read the study, it's at the centerforsmalltowns.org. It's interesting. But one of the things that came out of it was I would ask reporters, like, what time of day did you get to Clontarf or Ely or any of these small towns? And the average time of day that the reporters got out was between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Well, driving to Hancock between 10 and 2, and 80% of the people are gone because they're working. And so what happens then to a reporter who then drives into a small town, and it doesn't look like this idyllic notion of a full main street. It in fact has empty storefronts. It has not people walking around. And then it just reaffirms this negative narrative in this reporter's mind that this town is dying. Nobody wants to live here. So meanwhile, look at this. There's a quote in the upper left corner here. So a number of years ago, we still kind of have these threats of closing our post offices. And the idea here is that the reporter wanted to better understand, like, what's going to be the impact of closing a post office on the small town of Calumet, which was up by Duluth. And of course, like, people love talking to reporters and you get all sorts of like floats out of it. But what ended up in the newspaper was interesting. So let's look at the title. The title of the article was Iron Range Town Fighting for More Than the Mail. That sounds pretty good. Right below that, Calumet challenges the decision to close its post office, which is a social hub for its residents. I was like, social hub? Like, I never hung out at the post office in Hancock. We didn't have like coffee and rolls in there and stuff. And this is kind of funny until you think of how many people just read this. And people with no prior experience with a small town or rural place now believe that your post office is the place to go for social activities. Like, oh my gosh, okay, there's so much more to this. So meanwhile, again, what's the reporter do? You drive up and down Main Street, you go to the cafe. Who do you find in the cafe? The retired folks who talk about how life used to be. It's a narrative that continues itself. It reifies itself in what you see and who you talk to. So I will just say this. How did we arrive at this point at which we have such a terrible narrative about rural on one hand, but on the other hand, I can't find a home to buy? Like, hold on a minute. Like, we're actually in high demand and have been in high demand. In fact, during the pandemic, more and more reporters kept calling and saying, well, isn't this going to save rural America, man? I'm like, no, we've already saved ourselves. And let me tell you how. So let's talk about some of these trends. I'll just say that rural is changing. We're not dying, but in small towns, we're like microcosms for globalization. We're not these disconnected places from the world anymore. So really, we are just much more modern than ever before. So I like the Mark Twain quote, like, rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Like, show me all the dead towns. They're not around, and for good reason, because none of those things lead to the death of your small town. So what has happened since 1970? The rural population hasn't gone down, it's gone up. It's gone up by 11%. What's gone down is a relative. I'm an educator, folks, so this is your like math lesson for today. I mean, there's more coming up here, right? So I love being in the field of educators because it is my goal to teach about things like this. So here is a way that that data can be interpreted to view that to support a view that rural is dying, and when in fact the rural population went up by 11%. While the rural population went up by 11%, right? The pie of America got bigger. The whole pie got bigger. Even the area in the pie that's rural got bigger too, but the urban part of the pie got bigger faster Their growth rate was 48%. So now what does this lead to? A relative percentage decline in people that live in small towns and rural places. So in 1970, 1 in 4 people lived in rural places, but today it's like 1 in 6 to 1 in 8. Well, you know what? This almost always gets interpreted as people prefer urban living. Like, okay, one more way to think about this is at the same time, think about how big your suburbs have grown over the years. If you want to tell me there's an urban idealism, I'll just point you to the first ring suburbs and then the growth of the second ring suburbs. Our urban areas have not grown taller, they've grown wider. In fact, since 1974, all of the growth in our metropolitan areas happened at the expense of our urban areas spilling over into rural places and urbanizing them to such an extent they become urban. So the counties in gray here are the counties that were considered urban in 1974. And the counties in orange are the counties that are considered urban since then. So they transitioned from rural to urban since 1974. 25% of all the counties in this country have been reclassified from rural to urban. So that, that growth rate, 11%, that's even with taking away all of these people. Because imagine now what happens when my rural data, I have a county that gets taken away from me and given over to the rural category. So it's like I lose 80,000 people. But it's not a loss, it's a reclassification. So like our urban areas have not grown taller, they've grown wider. The core urban area populations have been stable, if not declining, for decades. What's growing is we've grown out, and it's called the concentric ring growth around every urban area in the country. So another way to kind of interpret the data, and at the same time, though, locally, we a lot of times just have a narrative like our population needs to grow, right? I call this the Ricky Bobby approach to population growth. So Ricky Bobby was a race car driver in a movie called Talladega Nights. It's not a documentary, it's a comedy. But in it, his dad told him, if you ain't first, you're last. And we kind of use that when it comes to our populations. Like our population needs to be growing. And then whenever the new data from the census comes out, everybody's like, hey, man, can you make a map of the data? And I'm like, why? To see if we're growing. Okay, well, here's all the counties that are not growing. All the ones in white, you're all big losers in this scenario. So let's look at why being a loser might not actually be a loser. So just as an example, this was one of the first charts I made in Western Minnesota that realized kind of what was going on. And when you look at this region in Western Minnesota, Prairie Region, Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission, their population from 1960 to 2010 went down by 35%. That fits in with the narrative about rural populations decline, right? They're big losers. But at the same time, look at the line right below that. The number of households in the region went up by 3%. How can that be? The average household size in this country has gone down a full person since 1940. So we went from 3.6 people in every home to 2.6. So when your population go down, it can more so be an artifact of having fewer people in all of your homes on average, which looks like your declining population is losing all people, when in fact it's only losing certain people. But the more common scenario today in our rural communities is you have 2 seniors in a household and one of them passes away, and the surviving spouse stays in that house. So what happens now? Your population just went down by 1, but your occupied households are the same. Like your households are still occupied. So meanwhile, these demographics actually work against growth in you right now, especially in our rural communities. And we'll talk about even deeper implications of this coming up. So if you look at the narrative, like Grant County, your population was flat or stagnant is the negative narrative for that instead of stable. Like you could say your population is stable, but no, we'd rather call it stagnant in the negative narrative, right? So Grant County, if you just use population change, and this is true for like all of these rural counties that have 0 or negative population change, they have growing number of households. So your number of households is growing. And what does that really mean though? We're in demand. So there was a data point I ran across early on that said like 49% of American households move every 5 years. We're down like 8 points off of this right now, but this was the first time I hit it 20 years ago. It was like, man, people are moving around all the time. 46% of Wisconsin households are moving every 5 years. So I wanted to better understand who's moving in and who's moving out of our rural communities. And what this bar chart, which was the first bar chart I made to reflect this trend in the year 2002, this is for Grant County, Minnesota, and this showed that even though Grant County's population was flat or stagnant or whatever you want to call it, right, there was a brain drain, right? There are kids moving out, and this is if the bar goes to the left, that means people in that age group moved out. And if the bar goes to the right, it means people in that age group moved in. And of course, there's a brain drain. Like 40% of the kids were leaving Grant County after high school. Brain drain, like books and journal articles galore about this. And then I was like, hey, what's this? People in their 30s and 40s and 50s are moving in. And there's people like 10 to 14-year-olds, and they're not moving by themselves. They're coming with their parents up there. I was like, what is this? So we want to better understand, who are these people? So we started doing newcomer studies, and I've done a number of them now over the past 20 years. And that is, we've done surveys of rural movers, people who are moving into our small towns and rural places. And we find people that have moved between 1 to 5 years ago. And we ask them lots of questions. And you do have a handout in front of you. That's a general takeaway that you can have from this, which is around push factors and pull factors. What are things pushing you away from where you were? And what are things pulling you in to where you want to go? So again, take note that we're not talking about 18-year-old preferences here. We're talking about 30 and 40-year-olds and their preferences. So they're going to be different. We need to acknowledge the fact that life changes your preferences in life. So anyway, here's a quick little, if you run across a newcomer in town, here's a quick little schema for how to better have a conversation about what brought them here and what do you like about this place. So really, when we had talked to those newcomers and we asked them, the top 3 reasons that newcomers say they moved to our rural communities were, number 1 was a simpler pace of life. And that was getting away from a commute, getting, immediate access to recreation, life on my time. Like, it was all of this very much independent, quality of life, simpler pace of life related aspects. The second reason was safety and security, which is especially high with people with children. And the third top reason was the low cost of housing. So nowhere in the top 10 was a job, which was like bonkers crazy for us, because as economic developers, a lot of times you're like, oh, why would people move here unless they had a job? Well, hello, 1940, apparently, because this has been shifting for decades now, and we'll get in some of this data, what it really looks like today. So when we did ask newcomers who moved just for a job, like, did you move because you had a job or a job offer? Just 41% of newcomer households said that they had that. Ultimately, they ended up kind of co-locating where they wanted to live based upon their house and parks and school districts. And generally, newcomers didn't compare one district to another. They truly believe rural districts provided opportunities for their kids to participate, be seen, like any rural district. They didn't really compete district to district. So anyway, just 41% moved just for a job or a job offer. So they've got all these other schemas going on. And just 25% of these newcomers, that is 1 in 4 newcomer households, are from the community. We tend to see the newcomers who grew up, moved away, and came back, the returnees, as people we recognize, right? Oh, it's like, oh, Lindsay's son moved back. I recognize you because you have a familiar face and a familiar name. But I'll just remind you, every time there's a person, a returnee that moves into your community that you may recognize and has access to social networks and social capital, there's 3 other households that don't. And what type of an experience do they have when they move to your community in terms of being welcomed, seen, invited, engaged, participating? So anyway, this is just a very huge aha for us that we realized early in the data is we need to be more aware of the churn of people that have been moving in and out of our communities for decades. It's not like this is even new. It's not like you have some stagnant community from the past that you're all just trying to work yourself into. Like, we're kind of a stew, and you keep ladling people in and ladling people out. You're not really a melting pot. So anyway, these communities have changed significantly over the years. Just half of the newcomer households have kids. We thought that was going to be a lot higher, but that's what it is. So we are going to talk now about the changes. The Minnesota study here was done a year before the pandemic, and the study in Montana was done a year into the pandemic. And one of the things that we see is fewer households are moving because they had a job there, which makes sense, right? During the pandemic, you had more and more employers affording an opportunity for their employees to work wherever, right? So you didn't need a job at all locally, which again, I'll remind you, during the pandemic in our rural communities especially, all these new people were interested in moving to our rural communities, and we were already full. So what did this do? This just exacerbated our home values because our rural communities were already in demand. And you may know, and you may remember, that we've had this housing shortage for 15 years. It's being confounded with a labor shortage because ultimately it's real hard to welcome labor in when there's nowhere for them to live. A lot of times you have recruitment struggles, and it's all hinging on housing right now. So housing, kind of a big enough conversation about that. So what we did notice that was interesting is the percentage of households who had lived in the community before went up. And part of this, we weren't sure what was going on. until we did these in-depth interviews and we had found out that really during the pandemic, it was almost impossible to find a home to buy. In fact, 40 to 60% of home sales were not stranger to stranger transactions, these arms like transactions. They were like, hey, Lindsay, I know your mom is looking to move out of her home. We have always loved her home. We're going to take you out for a meal and we're going to get this done. Bam. Oh, right away, I've got access to a social network. We saw a rise in the percentage of households during the pandemic that were from there or had networks there because you had to have access to a socially connected housing supply in order to find a home to buy during the pandemic. So that was fairly interesting to see. We can talk about any of these things in more detail in the webinar too, but I've got a lot of content to go over. But I'll just say, like, it was interesting to look at when we asked people to identify the factors that really were primary in what made them move. The social factors dominated. You know, it's not the economic factors in black here were secondary to all of the social factors. And to live closer to relatives doesn't actually always mean, I have a colleague, Randy Cantrell in Nebraska, will tell you that doesn't always mean they want to live in the same town as their family. It means they want to live generally in the same area as them sometimes. So just FYI, it's not always moving to mom's town. It's like moving back in the area that mom lives. So there's all these nuances to some of this data that you have to be aware of. So meanwhile, people are moving all the time. And now we get, you know, people are actually choosing to move to rural communities. And now we get, I would say, like, you know, this is not actually new. When you look back on the data, this trend of people moving into our rural communities started in the 70s. It slowed in the 80s. It really took off in the 90s and pretty much filled up every vacant home in rural America. And the 2000s and 10s, it slowed. And I think we have a reason why it slowed. I'll tell you about in just a minute here. So really, newcomers are looking at 3 to 5 towns, and they live in these, and they live in these vast regions. And we ask people, like, how are they participating in community life? We know social life is not dying either. They may not be involved in the Eagles and Lions clubs, but we're all involved in different types of groups. So what you see, even across Wisconsin, the number of nonprofits in the state is not going down, it's going up. There were a bunch that were revoked when they cleaned up their data one year, or over a period of like 5 years, and 9,000 nonprofits were removed because they were just not even existing anymore. So anyway, if I add those back in, you see this trend line of the number of nonprofits across Wisconsin continues to grow. In fact, when you look at Grant County, again, they kind of cleaned up the data here. I don't have the revocations for the county, but there's 347 nonprofits in the county. There's 74 units of government, and they all need leaders. They all need people to serve as leaders. I do positional leadership studies. If you want to know more about that, we could talk about that at another time. But really what you see here is your nonprofit sector is like thriving. The number of nonprofits that are filing full 990s, and if you're filing full 990s, that means you have gross receipts of $50,000 or more. You've more than tripled the nonprofits that are filing full 990s. And for me, nonprofits are their avenues of social vibrancy. It's where people get involved and engage, and you can invest in your nonprofits. I can't invest in Hardware Hank on Main Street necessarily, but I can invest in my local clubs. So the revenue goes up across these years. That well exceeds the rate of inflation. The assets are well exceeding the rate of inflation in these. So this is not the story of social life dying. In fact, it's the opposite. When you look across the state here, we know that 1 in 22 adults in Wisconsin have to serve as a nonprofit or government leader. You rank 13th in the country in the highest demand for leaders just by the number of nonprofits generally. When you look at the types of ways people are engaged, it's generally churches are number 1 in just about every state in the country. Then we got educational institutions, and these are like scholarship groups or other kid-related groups, or then we get recreation sports groups too, and community improvement. So this is the current composition of your nonprofit sector. But I'll just remind you that most of your nonprofits, 54% of your nonprofits have been created in just the past 30 years. So the idea here is not that people have to like get involved in this old antiquated social infrastructure. It's like people are creating nonprofits left and right. What kinds of the new groups are they? Recreation, sports, leisure, athletics, education, boom, bam, bam. Education, high in civic engagement in the upper Midwest. Philanthropy, arts, culture. So this is, again, not the story of social life dying. In fact, it's thriving. What we seem to be challenged with is involving these newcomers in our community groups. When a lot of times, what do we do? Like, oh, Doug, you're new in town. You ready to join the school board? Or, some generic like EDA board? Like, oh, why do we think that's a good idea? Like, you have to actually engage people slowly to get them involved in leadership at any point in our rural communities. But we do. We tend to make fun of the young people, right? And there's even a book out there called Malcolm Harris that talks about kids these days, that every generation are like, oh, kids these days, they're so lazy and entitled. Every generation does that. The baby boomers, you were called lazy and entitled too by your parents, and now we're doing it to the younger one. And I'm Gen X. Nobody cares about me. We're in between like the big ones. So anyway, what do we do? How do we talk about this? You look at this like the generation gap, the me decade, 20 something. It's all about me, the me generation. Like being selfish is not a trait of a generation. It's a trait of an age. And I'm going to let 18 to 25-year-olds be selfish and figure out where they're going to spend their time and their passions. So meanwhile, what has shifted most dramatically, I really want you to take home with is this: how people have been engaged historically have been in place-based groups with a broad focus. And that could be like the Plattsville Community Betterment Club. It only helped Plattsville. It didn't help any other town around, but it did everything, right? As a narrow geography with a broad focus. It would help raise money for the school or the church or a new park or whatever it was. Broad focus, narrow geography. Today, people want to be involved in just the opposite. Rather than a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. Rather than a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. The Northeastern Iowa Canoe Association. It's like 14 counties big. People are going canoeing. They're not doing everything. They're going canoeing. Well, there's a struggle here right now, I'll tell you, in connecting these place-based groups with these interest-based groups. If you're interested in doing social capital work in that area, let me know. I'd be happy to work with you. So really, we need to treat these new people as more than warm bodies. Like they're more than just warm bodies in our town to be plugged in. Like we need to actually appreciate where these folks are coming from. So down here, I say start with a small request. It is not like, hey, you want to join the Lions or what is some generic thing? It is, hey, we're going to flip burgers for the firemen on Friday. You want to help us out? Like that's a basic engagement pattern. So I think how we approach newcomers has to change a little bit in terms of the engagement strategies that we've had. But at the same time, just identifying that these newcomers have been diversifying a rural economy. Our economy is more diverse than ever before. And a lot of times when I ask urbanites, like, hey, would you ever move to a rural community? Like the top answer I get is, I'm not a farmer. It's like, oh, I know, but like, man, we have so many other jobs. And even in agriculture, it's highly technological, folks. Like what we did is we did this study in Minnesota that said, you're right. Like any one place is not going to have a diverse economy. But when you put put up to 5 to 7 counties together, you end up with the same diversity in your economy that you find in the metro. So while the job may not be in Hancock, I need to know that it exists in Benson down the road. But I need to get over that parochialism because we actually live in mega regions. Dartmouth called this mega regions. It's about commuting patterns, about how big of an area we actually work in. So in Grant County, every day, 7,100 people commute in to the county and cross that county boundary to work. And every day, 12,000, almost 700 people that live in the county commute out for work somewhere else. And just 118 people both live and work in the county, just 44%. This is common. Like just 51, Minnesota anyway, just 51% of people live in the county or work in the county they live in. But we're trying to make decisions at all these, county levels. But that's not how we live. That's how we work. I'll just remind you that all these county boundaries were drawn during a time of horse and buggy. They don't reflect how people live, but we have to make decisions in them. So again, we got Lafayette and Iowa County here, just 35% in Iowa County live and work in the county. You got thousands of people commuting in and thousands of people commuting out, and same with Lafayette. So really, people are also telecommuting. We found out during the latest newcomer survey that 21% of newcomer households, so either the person who responded or there's somebody else in the household, 21% had somebody who was telecommuting, and that was before the pandemic. So we need to think about the extent to which the pandemic wasn't just causing a lot of this. It was exacerbating any of the issues that we may have had. But we actually in our rural communities have really great broadband, and you need to lift that up because there tends to be a negative narrative that there's a digital divide. Well, actually not. Like some places might not have it, but like the internet I had in Hancock was faster. The broadband was fiber. It was faster than I have in St. Cloud. So in many places, our co-ops and many of our private places have instituted gig fiber, and you need to lift that up. So really getting back to when I talked earlier about, the reason why people would move to your community is a job. Well, there's a chicken or egg argument here about do jobs bring people or do people bring jobs? And if again, we're 1920, jobs are bringing people here, but today it's way less than half. So we're decoupling all of these things locally. And really, we just need to ensure that we have somewhere for people to live and recognize that when we're living in a place, we live in a regional community. And I like the middle of nowhere. That I like the take the middle of nowhere concept and just turn on its head a little bit. Like we actually live in the middle of everywhere. And there's a handout that you've got here that I want to share with you. That is an exercise we do in extension called Living in the Middle of Everywhere. And I've got your map in the area or your map in the region there. But what we do is we have people on a single piece of paper, identify your age, and sometimes it's your age range, and then identify on this map, put a star where you live, an X where you work, and then draw a boundary around how far in the past year have you gone to shop and eat out. And then how far in the past year have you gone to play and recreate? And it's huge. These boundaries are huge. You're going to recreate like hours away from your home. So once you imagine you did this for all your communities around you or people that lived in counties next to you, you're overlapping with each other all the time. It becomes a fascinating exercise to do community building at the local level. So imagine you had 100 of these from people done in your town. Now in the top right corner, it says list 3 to 5 of your favorite assets. This is probably my favorite part. This is how you find out about things like, oh, I didn't know there's a new winery like 2 counties over because I don't always get 2 counties over. Like when you do exercises like this repeatedly in your community every 2 or 3 years, you find out about all these new things. And this directly feeds your marketing, your recruitment. You want to recruit people to your region, you better recruit them and not like a mirror of you and just name off things that you're interested in. You need to know what else is going on. So the Pew Research Institute did this study years ago that asked Americans, like, all right, Americans, we know that 80% of you live in the city and 20% of you live in the country or rural places, but if you lived wherever you wanted, if you could choose wherever you want, where would you live? 51% of Americans said they prefer to live in small towns and rural places. Like having this desire for small town and rural living, you don't need to apologize for it. Like, yeah, it's going okay. Like you can feel good about living in a rural place. You don't need to apologize. You're not dying. You're actually helping bring in the vibrancy of where we're going. But I will tell you that the number one audience for your negative narrative in your community are your kids. And if you're working in school districts, and if you've got students and you've got teachers in these districts that hold on to a negative narrative when in fact you just don't understand the dynamics of rural change, those kids are never going to see these communities as someplace to return to as a success. Because right now it's very consistent. We hear this narrative that for the kids that are returnees, kids that become adults and move back, that they're like, oh, you couldn't make it in the broader world, huh? Like, ah. So anyway, Nebraska does its youth survey every year that asked, is there a negative stigma with returning to the place you live now? So imagine you had 2 school districts and they were next to each other. In one district, 80% of the kids were asked like, hey, if you move away, do you think you're going to come back? And in that community, 80% of the kids said they'd come back. But in the other community, just 40% said they'd come back. What's the difference between these two? A narrative of hope and opportunity for these kids. Do they actually see this place as someplace they can succeed in? And we do know we try to do visits, right? But they bring kids in our businesses, but at the same time, that's limited because they still go home to a negative narrative household. They continually tell them there's nothing here for you, and now you need to move on. So again, bring your parents. Well, the research is clear that bringing the kids in isn't enough. Bring their parents with them. That one little thing right there. So there's a question that we asked in our newcomer survey, which is, do you believe the community you moved to is welcoming? And a full 78% of our newcomer households said it was. But what we found is that when you split it by another question here, which is, we had asked a question here, which is, do you believe the community you moved to, or do you believe that you're going to be living in this community in 5 years? And it kind of gets at how it's going, right? If they're not having a good time here, they're going to be like, I'm probably not going to be here. But if it's going great, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'll be here in 5 years, right? So anyway, what do you find is that with those that report the community is welcoming, 86% of households are like, oh yeah, I'll be here in 5 years. But for those that report the community is not welcoming, you have a retention issue. Now it's 44%. I'll just say this, like in a tight labor market, we've got a super tight labor market. Labor's got power to choose and go generally wherever they want or wherever they can find a home. And then what's going to differentiate one community from another at that point? It's everything but the job. If all you can do is recruit for the job, it's not enough. It's clear in this research that quality of life are driving forces that you need to connect to allow people to be residents of this community full-time. So there's more in this model I can share in the future, but we do have a whole concept area called resident recruitment. And for us, schools are at the front lines here. You know exactly who's moving into the community of those that have kids. And that's half these newcomer households. So there are lots of different ideas that are school-centered for us that help welcome people into our community. But really for me, the school's the anchor institution, folks. Like you are connecting the past, with the present and the future for every one of these towns. There is a common value system built around this school that people can adhere to, a common identity that people have based upon that. And you could be developing partnerships with your broader community, letting the students see the community and the broader communities around them as a laboratory, that nothing is disconnected from the academia you've got. I've written chapters in how to integrate math and science classes with service projects in the broader community. Just go and get wetlands data and analyze it in your stats class. Like, I mean, it's harder than that, but I mean, it is. You've got data sitting around you from the data point of view. So a lot of change is coming. Like really 30% of your homeowners right now are seniors, and another 45% are baby boomers. And what we do know is right now there's a housing shortage that's driven almost all in part by the fact that this older population, which in the past moved out of their homes after the age of 70, this current older generation are staying in their homes. And when this older generation stays in their homes, it inhibits the ability for people to move in. We actually are inhibiting the ability to welcome in new labor because our homes are filled. You want to talk more about housing, there's no shortage of that conversation either. But we do know we are seeing in the most rural counties in Minnesota and in the country that have the highest death rate, now have the highest in-migration rate. And why is that? It's because through death comes rebirth. And you're coming out with one and two person households, and in with 2 to 4, 3 to 5. You have to talk about death, folks, as we move forward here, because there is a lot coming. But through death comes rebirth. And for me, when you look at, imagine in all of your communities right now, 3/4 of your homes turned over, and half of those homes brought kids with them. What is that going to do to your population? What is that going to do to your school enrollment? So in many ways, right now, our housing churn is stuck, and we're waiting for people to move out, move over, or to move on in many ways. So for me, rural is durable. We're desirable, we're engaging, and diversifying. And these newcomers are making a choice to create groups, build their community, diversify the economy, buy in businesses, and they're more than warm bodies. So really, this choice, people are moving to your town for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. I will just tell you, nobody ever said in my thousands of interviews and surveys that I've done that they want to move to your town for pity. Nobody's like, hey, Hancock, I know you lost your grocery store 24 years ago. We're here to help you out. Like, nobody says this. We should celebrate the fact that people are choosing to move to our rural communities and love it. And when you lift up these voices, you can tell a whole new narrative, especially a narrative that your kids can hear in your school districts about hope and returning. So with that, I just want to say thanks for your time here today, your passion, just for still bringing me in. I would be happy to engage with you on April 12th. Lindsay, Doug will find some way to follow up with you on that. We're going to make sure to get a copy of the PowerPoint to you too. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to me either via Lindsay, or if you've got common questions you want to answer on the webinar, I'd be open to that too. So with that, I'm just going to stop my share here and just want to say thank you all for your interest and your passion for your communities. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ben, for sharing your expertise with us and your flexibility in joining us virtually when weather interrupted your travel. We are grateful for your engagement tonight as we transition to our proud rural educator panel. I'll introduce the panelists. Dr. Jen Collins is a proud rural kid from Eldridge, Iowa, who is currently a visiting associate professor in elementary education at the University of Iowa. Over her 24-year career, she has taught in K-12 at both the elementary and middle level, dabbled in gifted and talented education, and eventually transitioned to teacher preparation at the university level. She proudly served as a faculty member and director of the School of Education at UWP and collaborated with colleagues to redesign a rurally focused teacher preparation curriculum that was responsive to the needs of our rural schools and communities. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Jen Collins. Oh, and would it be possible to raise the screen, please? And the lights on, please. Thank you. Rick Erickson is an award-winning high school teacher at the Bayfield School District in Bayfield, Wisconsin, where he teaches high school chemistry, physics, and alternative education. Among his laurels are the 2014 Wisconsin High School Teacher of the Year and the 2019 Presidential Award for Excellence in Math and Science. He has a passion for place-based experiential learning, and as an educator, he is happiest when his students are exploring the rich Lake Superior region and actively participating in real-world science. Please welcome to the stage Rick Erickson. And our final panelist tonight is Dr. Frank King, who is an associate professor in ethnic studies at UW-Platteville. His areas of interest are Afrocentric philosophy, hip-hop pedagogy, Black studies, and, let me flip the page here, the criminal justice system. He recently published his anthology, From Here to There, Race, Class, and Gender in the United States. Please welcome Dr. Frank King.
Mic check. Oh, there we go. We are on. All right. Thank you for joining us, panelists. We have a couple of questions.
1, 2, okay.
There we go. We will ask them.
Oh, good.
You are welcome to respond. We can hear from all three of you, or we can, we'll just kind of let it flow organically. So the first one, if you would please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and what have your experiences been living and teaching in a rural space?
Start with me. Hi, everybody. I'm Jen Collins. Living and working, who am I right now? I am a visiting associate professor in elementary education at the University of Iowa. My experience is living and teaching in rural. I'm from, proudly, as I said in my bio, from Eldridge, Iowa, which is about an hour and a half south on 61, here outside the Quad Cities. When I was growing up, my parents moved there in the 60s. There were 345 people in the town, and when I was growing up, there were about 1,000 folks there. I was also one of those kids that couldn't wait to get out of my small rural town. I wanted to leave, and so I left and taught in an urban area for a good part of my teaching career. But then once the opportunity came for me to return, I continued to return to the Midwest and returned to small towns. So I came back and was here at Platteville very happily for 7 or 8 years, and I took a quick trip out to the East Coast, and where am I again? Is I have come back home again. So I'm one of those proud returners who really enjoys living and working, and especially being involved with teacher preparation in a rural space.
Buju Rick Indigenakaz, Erickson and Dudame, Mukamaning and Dunjaba, Oshke Udenang and Dan Non Gom, Niman Wanda Mama Ayayan. I just introduced myself in Ojibwe Moan. I'm not Anishinaabe, but 80% of the students we teach in Bayfield are. One of the things that we'll talk about, I'm sure, in some of the questions is how important it is to engage in your community when you're in a rural area, especially as a teacher coming into that area. So my wife, Lori, who's sitting down here also, and I'm probably going to be asking her often. I'm going to probably be phoning a friend because she's much more able to answer questions on the spot than I am. But anyway, Lori and I decided to, when we moved to Bayfield, to take Ojibwe Moan classes so that we could learn the language of the majority of the people who are there. So and my first language teacher, as much as he made fun of me and laughed at me for the way I spoke and said, "You sound like a Sweden person trying to speak Ojibwe," I was like, "That's because that's what I am." And so, but he said, I appreciate that you're here, and I really would like you to take this language out and so other people can hear the language, and I want you to be proud of what you've done. And so he's asked me wherever I go to introduce myself in Ojibwe Moan, so that's what I did. So quick little history. I grew up in Cloquet, Minnesota. That was part of my introduction. Mukamaning is the Ojibwe Moan name for Cloquet, the place of the knife. And so that's where I was born and raised. I went to school in Minnesota, finished at UMD in Duluth, and then my wife and I moved to the Twin Cities. So I taught in a suburban school district for the first 10 years of my career. But we found ourselves in the car driving back up north to Lake Superior pretty much every weekend, and it took us, I mean, we're not the sharpest tools around, but it didn't take us too long to realize that we should be living there, not going there on weekends. So we looked for places to move back to, and we ended up in Bayfield, and it's been a great move. We've been there now for 30 years. I've been teaching for 40 years. This is my final year. I'm retiring in June. I'm very excited about it. but very proud of what we've done in the 40 years that we've been in education. We've been teaching chemistry and physics for 40 years, but then 12 years ago started to rebuild an alternative education program that's place-based and experiential-based, and very excited about that particular thing. So we'll have a chance to talk about that later also. Miigwech, Bizendawieg.
So you have to excuse me for a second. I'm trying to get my thoughts right. I didn't prepare for this because I wanted to be more off the cuff, and now that I'm off the cuff, I'm like, what the hell am I going to talk about? So can I ask you all a question? How many people listen to hip hop? A couple people. Anybody ever hear of KRS-One? So Dean Kelly, we're the same age, so yeah, we're part of that generation. So KRS-One is a hip hop scholar, artist, and his name stands for knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone. And he has a nickname called the Teacher. And I used to listen to him constantly. He was my favorite artist. He still is my favorite artist. And so when it comes to hip hop, and like hip hop, I talk about hip hop pedagogy, it was my first teacher. Hip hop was my first teacher. The school system really didn't work out for me. I really didn't like going to school. I didn't like learning from that perspective. So what I wanted to do is incorporate the way I learn into the classroom. So I've always wanted to be a teacher. I think since my 16 or 17 years old. I thought that was the path I wanted to do. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to go to school and do that. And the school population I was thinking about teaching, I'm from suburban America, but I wanted to teach in the cities. I'm like, I'm gonna go in the hood. I wanna teach the hood as kids and try to like empower them and change the world. And I wound up in Platteville, Wisconsin. But the one thing about Platteville, Wisconsin is I fell in love with the students. The students were, even though they may not agree with the information I provide, we were still from a respectful component. I respected them and they respected me. And I think being in the Midwest, my wife always says, like, this is your calling, being here in Platteville, Wisconsin, and being able to teach students that are from towns that have never been in any places where they experience diversity from a large-scale perspective. Most of the students tell me that they grew up in towns with like 300 or 400 people and they never interacted with people of color. And they say, Platteville's the most diverse place I've ever been to. Yes, and I'm like, okay, but I take it and I'm like, all right, so you've been from a place like this. Now let's learn about the experiences of people that you may interact with in the schools. And I had a son he went to school here, and the great thing about small towns is that there's not many private schools. I'm thinking that, Platteville doesn't have a private school, so I'm gonna talk about the case with Platteville itself. You have the richest kid in the town and the poorest kid in the town going to the same school. That is an amazing thing that is a great equalizer, where they're getting the same type of education, right? So I think that's a beautiful thing about small towns, and I think that that's one of the reasons why I gravitate to small towns, is that there's these smidgens of components that most larger places don't necessarily get. And of course, we don't get good restaurants, we get Arby's, but I think that the good thing is that we can at least see in small towns there's something that's special about that, and I kind of like that area.
Thank you so much. Building off of what all of you said, but especially what Dr. King said, is the sort of gravitation towards small towns and small towns being special. What for you makes your small town special? Or what is if people were like coming to visit your small town, what would be the must see, must do, must experience about the small town that you're talking about?
I don't know. I'm gonna say this. I like the fact that I can go to a butcher shop and get meat that has been freshly cut. I'm a steak eater. I love steaks. I know Dean Kelly. I know you're a pescatarian, but there's something about a steak and really good quality things like that. And plus, I think that most Americans it's very important for us to see where our food comes from. And Wisconsin is an agricultural state. And seeing who creates the food and who makes the food. Like just this past week, our classes have talked about immigration, and we talk about like how there's such a large migrant population that does the farming, and how we must respect that, and like how we can incorporate those populations into small town America. I think that's one of the great things about that is like I can actually go to a fruit stand and get corn and good corn, and I can do those type of things, and morale mushrooms, you know, and things like that. I just think that that's something that people in larger areas don't get to experience. You know, like New York, and like we have like food deserts in a lot of cities, and I think that's one of the big problems that we face is that like the idea of food.
That's a great response. So I'm going to speak from, I don't know how familiar you are with Bayfield, but Bayfield is at the tip of Wisconsin, and so we are on the border of the Apostle Islands National Lake Shore. So when people come there, my first answer to that question was, oh, it's obvious. Lake Superior, it's this amazing place. The Apostle Islands, the sea caves at the Apostle Islands. So there's all these natural phenomena where that's where my mind goes. But I just had a real cool opportunity a few weeks ago. Several gentlemen who I started teaching with in the Twin Cities came up to visit me, and I took a couple days off, and we spent some time together. And we went to some of those places, but the best part of that visit was not those places. It was the people that we encountered when we were at those places. They're like, they said, you know, we've seen the Apostle Islands. We've gone to these waterfalls. Just take us around town and show us what's here. And so we went to one of the orchards, and it's a former student of mine who now is running the place. And so they're doing all this experimental work, and we spent 2 hours there just learning about what's happening at that particular orchard. Then we went to the fish hatchery in Red Cliff and talked about them restocking the fish of Lake Superior and the inland lakes. But we were there for like 2 hours talking to the people that worked there who were former students of mine. And as we're about to go to the third place that I had lined up, they're like, okay, we haven't eaten yet, and I'm getting really hungry, but I really want to go to this other place. But we need to limit ourselves to one question so that we can get out of here, because they were so excited to talk to people who were from there. And when we went to lunch after that, they said, you know, actually, the keynote was a great segue to this, because they said, my view of rural America is that it's a bunch of people there who really, it's a brain drain. They said, but everybody we've talked to is like super intelligent. Like they are passionate about what they do. They know their business extremely well, and every one of them has talked about how they've had to adapt as time has passed, and how they've adapted the farm to meet the needs of what they need to do today. And they were just super excited about the conversations they had with people. So even though I think my first response to that was, oh, I'd take them to the Apostle Islands, I'd go show them Lake Superior, I think I would still do those things, but I would be very cognizant that what really matters is the interactions with people.
Use that one instead. Rick kind of stole my answer a little bit, but I will riff on that just a little bit. Is just talking about the people, because no one looks on their guide map to Iowa and says, Eldridge, Iowa, I gotta go there. You know, my hometown, even though it has grown quite a bit since I was there, really just has now fast food restaurants and 2 stoplights, which it didn't have when I was growing up. But it does have Alan Jerry's, which is the bar. And I say that because that's the place where you go and get your burger basket, and you run into the people that were my dad's patients, because he was the local dentist. It's where all the kids that I went to high school with that are still around, if you're going to run into somebody, that's the place. That's the center of town. And then you sit there all day and watch a Hawks game. Go Hawks. And then you sit there and have a beer with your friends, and then people are coming in and out. And I'm sure in all your small towns there is that place that you go And that's where you're going to run into your friends and your family. And that's the best part of it for me, is being able to go back and reconnect with the folks that were there, and it happens in a bar. Or do we have to turn this one off?
Does it give feedback? Okay, I'll try it. Thank you for your answers. Ben talked about pull factors into a community. Would each of you mind talking about key items that were or are on your need to have list when you are looking at a rural community? Rick, I think you might have talked about this a little bit, about visiting there and then deciding this is where you want to live. Is there anything else on your need to have list?
Can I jump in first? And I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but the truth is, a dating community. I do feel like if you're going to recruit folks into your small town, there needs to be people that they could interact with, right? And possibly fall in love with, and, you know, and some of the research does show that one of the concerns sometimes with small towns is that this dating pool is rather small. And so I say it kind of jokingly, but it is really a true question about what are you going to do in your free time, right? What's the pull that coming in besides your job? What kind of things can you do in your free time? And then who are you going to do those things with? So.
All right, so I think I want to be careful about this, but first of all, for sure, I want to say that I want to find a place that's true to my passion. So I'm an outdoor person, and so being by Lake Superior, in a place where I can kayak, canoe, ski, bike, whatever, that's important to me. And so, but that's pretty much any rural area, right? Well, maybe not sea kayak, but the rest of it, we could be doing just about anywhere. But I also want to be really careful because I think what's really cool about everywhere, but definitely rural areas, is that everything has its strengths and has things that are exciting. And part of the excitement is learning about those things, right? And so I know that when our family decided to leave the Twin Cities, I had a great discussion with the person who was the principal at the time, and we had a little apprehension about moving to a small town because we had a lot of those stereotypes that were shown on the screen earlier, right? The schools aren't as good. It's a stagnant place. They're dying. We had people telling us, like, you're making a mistake. You're leaving a very strong school district in a suburban area that's thriving, and you don't know what you're going to encounter when you go to these small towns. And but I fortunately had a principal, and so it did make us think. But we really wanted to be back up by the lake. And then in sitting down with the principal, he said, you know, you need to just, all those people that are saying those things, you just need to take them with a grain of salt, disregard them. Because really, what matters, our girls were young at the time, they were 4 and 6, and many people were saying, you're taking them out of a really strong education system. It had to do with the education system. And what the principal told me was, you know, everywhere you go, schools are good. They have good teachers, they have good people, and what really matters is the support they get at home. And so wherever you go, your kids are gonna be okay. And so you just have to trust that and believe that, and I would say that is entirely true. That it's, making that move was at first a little scary, but it was the best thing to do. It was great for us, it was great for our kids. And so I think there might be these things that you have to have, but I think we have to be careful that they might not be what we think they are, because there are good schools everywhere. And I think that's a thing that scares some people sometimes.
I hate driving. And so one of the things I think that we need in small towns is some form of really good public transportation infrastructure. There's this really cool video on YouTube, like a series on YouTube. It's called Not Just Bikes, and it talks about like living in Amsterdam and other places in Europe that have like very, very great public transportation, even in very small towns. So it's not just talking about like Amsterdam itself, but they're also talking about like outside areas in the Netherlands. And it's like just amazing that we should have some type of infrastructure, a bicycle infrastructure, easy paths to get to like Walmart and places like that, and also outside of the areas to be able to venture off and actually for better communication or communities from various small towns. And so some way to have something like that. I feel like we should be like have like some type of system. And I know we have the bus system, but even the bus system is not accessible for, say, like somebody in a wheelchair. So so what about for those people? Or how can we have like an easy, accessible way that, hey, you know what, I want to go to Madison today. I want to take the train and just like hop on a train and just do it. So I think that component is something that small towns are missing. But I know small towns also don't have the funding for that. So we need to vote people into office that would want to do some type of like actual modernization to be able to have more community from small town to town to larger areas.
Thank you so much. The next question is about place. All of you have talked about the importance of place in the connection to rural. And so how would you describe your experience in living in rural spaces, living, working, and playing in rural spaces?
The lack of, and when we think about rural, and I talk to this to my students, when we think about rural, we think about, different racial identities from urban standpoint. When we think of urban, we think more like cities, and then with cities, you have more larger communities of color. When we think about rural, we don't necessarily think of from that. We think more of a primarily white population, except for like in the southern states. But like if we look at Midwestern rural, where politicians always call the real America, and that's the image that is always projected. So we hear like rural society, urban society. And I think that from my standpoint, I really believed that when I first came here. I was like, my gosh, it's just gonna be like, various people just gonna be like throwing rocks at me or something like that. And that was my perception. And that was something that was not the case. So I wind up immersing myself in the community, wind up like being a part of the police and fire commission and actually learning about the community and learning the infrastructure and like learning how works go. People keep asking me if I want to run for office. That ain't happening, but it's still that kind of thing. So like, and then like developing hobbies, like now I like fishing. So, and my wife, she likes to go camping and everything. And so like we're kind of developing that idea of that we never really even considered doing. And another thing, why is everybody in Wisconsin have cabins? It seems like everybody owns a cabin. How can I get a cabin? That's what I'm just like, it seems like, oh yeah, we went to our cabin this weekend. I'm like, where the hell y'all get these cabins from? So, sorry.
I don't have a cabin. My house is my cabin. The screen porch is the cabin. We have the house and the screen porch cabin. So, you know the saying, everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. Well, I'm a slow learner. I didn't learn most of those things in kindergarten. Fortunately, I have a family who's been patient with me and taught me a lot of things. And I think the most important thing that helped me engage with the community in Bayfield was being instructed really you need to go in and be a listener. I have a tendency to, when I want to get something done, I want it done fast and I want it done now. And so I feel like that's helped me in a lot of ways. It's helped me to get things done that I feel they need to be done. But I was told to slow down, that I don't know what this community needs or wants. And so for me to come in and say like, hey, I know what you want and I know what you need and I know how to get you there was not the right approach. And so I was instructed to be a listener and learn about the community. And that really, that slowing down and that process of opening up to see what was there rather than coming in with this narrow vision of what I thought was there was super important. And so I think the thing that has been the greatest asset is being that active listener so that you can engage with the community in an authentic way rather than my own version of what I think it should look like.
I think from my experience growing up in a small town where I seriously knew everybody in my high school and everybody in my town, and then wanting to get away and moving. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina for about 15 years, and I loved the idea of being invisible and being able to go somewhere and not running into people everybody that I knew. But I will say, after 15 years of that, I couldn't wait. When I got the job in Platteville, I was so excited because I wanted to go back to a town where I would know people. And I would go to the post office and I would know someone, and I would get to know the students in the area and be part of a community. And I realized that I was really hardwired to be in a rural community. It's what I understood, and I think until you have the opportunity to move away and experience something different, you don't sometimes realize the essence of who I am as a person is a rural kid. And that's really hard to explain to somebody who is not from a small town and didn't grow up with that kind of insular kind of community. But it's really what I felt was kind of missing when I was out in North Carolina. Not that I didn't love it out there, and I had a great experience and great teaching experiences, but I think coming back to the Midwest and coming back to a smaller town like Platteville, I was able to just kind of exhale, and it's like, these people get me. And they get me in a way, and I get them in a way that I never felt like when I was in a big urban center, right? And there were benefits to that. I mean, I liked being it, like I said, but I think you come back and you just feel like, oh, right, these are my people. You know, even though I didn't know anybody at that point, I got them and they got me. Like, my culture was here. And so I think for me, that has been the greatest gift, to kind of realize that, what I thought I was running away from my whole life, and then you find yourself being pulled back to that and feeling like this is like home for me, so.
Turning it on. Okay, we'll just pass the one mic rather than turning one on, one off. One thing we know about the School of Education is we do tend to draw a lot of students that define their home as small or rural. Would you show a show of hands if you would define home for you as small or rural? Quite a few. And we also see data that our students are choosing to go and work in those places. So obviously they have found kind of what Jen described, what draws them there and that value of what it is. So having educators on the panel and thinking about your students and the young people you work with, what would you say are their perceptions of rural?
That's a great question, because I've been at Platteville and now I'm at the University of Iowa, right? And in the state of Iowa, we still have 35% of kids that still are being schooled in rural areas. And so I think what I hear the narrative is in some ways they feel they need to apologize for being from a rural community, and I have to keep reminding them that this is like, it's a strength and it's something to be proud of. There's so many great things in small rural communities that I said in my previous answer that folks don't get in a larger urban center. But I hear students saying that they want to go back, they would like to stay in their rural communities, and that's where they feel most comfortable. And so they'd like to find ways to go back and, you know, serve the people that also brought them up. They feel connected to those places. That's what I hear, is they've connected to those places and they want to go back and contribute and help move the community forward.
All right, so my perspective is teaching in the public schools, right? I primarily teach high school students, and I'm gonna say that if I asked them that question, they would have absolutely no idea how to answer it. They don't perceive themselves as being rural or urban or suburban. They perceive themselves as being teenagers. And so their view of the world is this is all they've ever known. This is where they've always been. To them, a big city is Ashland, which has a population of 8,000. And so, because that's where the fast food places are. We don't have a fast food place in Bayfield. We have one gas station. So their perspective, but it doesn't matter to them because that's their life. That's who they are. If anything, and they do talk about leaving, some of them do, but a lot of them want to come back. And they have such a strong support network in the community, it's extremely hard for them to leave. Even the idea of going to Ashland for a vocational program or to Platteville or UW-Eau Claire, that's a huge stretch for them to leave that support network by that big a distance. So they think about it, but they don't even really know what it looks like. So we do try to get them out as much as we can. Take them to UW Superior, take them to University of Minnesota Duluth, take them out where they can see these other places. But when we do that, they just like pull together in this like super tight knit group of kids, and you can just see they look like deer in headlights, just looking around at all these people moving around, and they talk within themselves, but they really don't interact. They're in awe, really, of being out of that environment. But when it comes, they know they're rural, and they're super protective of it. It's a real, and we have a lot of tourism in the summer, and our kids are really protective of the community, and they get very, they get very annoyed when people ask them things like, "Well, what do you do here all year?" And they're like, "We do what teenagers do. We do, it's whatever's available to us. We might go to the lake, or we might get together and, I don't know, go to a basketball game or whatever." To them, they're just living a teenage life, and I don't think they see it any different than that.
I'm trying to figure out how to do this. One thing I think that my job is to tell the students or explain to students or share there's a broad world out there. It's a much larger world. So even though students may want to gravitate to small towns, and I really understand that they have a community, they have the cultural dynamics and everything, but it's just trying to share with them that there's a larger world out there, and then there are people that are in those larger worlds and telling about their experiences. I think from my perspective, if students do leave the classroom with that, then I think I have became very successful. But from understanding, like, I can't change necessarily their viewpoints or anything, but just kind of like open their mind and thinking outside the box of what these communities have experienced historically and contemporarily, and I think that's my goal. And so, for like you were talking about, like students like being in those small towns, but and being in those small things when they go outside of their small towns and outside of their comfort zone, being able to like, okay, well, I can understand why folks in these communities are living and what they're experiencing, and then that's, for me, that's the success.
Thank you. The next question is about place-based education. And all of you have talked about the importance of broadening students' horizons, whether it's incorporating new ideas from outside the classroom to outside the community to within the community. One of the questions that I have is that how are you bringing the community into the classroom and the classroom, or in the classroom into the community? So how are you bridging those gaps?
Yeah, it's a hard time. I think that we try to open like sessions or discussions. So what we have usually are like large, forums, if you will, and we try to open it up to members of the community. So I think for me, my purpose would be to try to be able to share the information I have in the classroom and share that with the general community in Southwest Wisconsin. If they come, then hopefully they'll get something out of it. If not, then we tried, and hopefully we'll keep continuing doing that. So I think for me, I think that I feel like I'm an educator, and that's all I am, or in a lot of ways. And I think from that perspective, I think just being able to share the information that myself and my colleagues have studied extensively to be able to share with the rest of the community is it's what a primary goal for me is.
I hope you have a long time for this one. Doug wrote this question for me, didn't you? And I like the way you rephrased it. And I feel extremely fortunate that I am in the place where I am. And I feel like my administration has given me a lot of leeway and a lot of freedom to do what I think is best for students. And I've taken advantage of that opportunity. And my view in the alternative education program, so there's a difference. My alternative education program, we do exactly what Doug described at the end. I don't bring the community to the classroom. We go out. I got my bus license so that I can have access And any given day, the school has 3 minibuses. The only people who have licenses to drive them are a couple of custodians and me. And so there's always a bus at my disposal. So my goal is to be out of the classroom every day. And rather than bringing a speaker in, like if I want somebody to talk to the students about restocking fish in Lake Superior, we go to the hatchery. We don't bring the hatchery manager to us. And a lot of that is, in the alternative education program, I'm also working with students who have not been successful in a traditional classroom setting, right? And so I'm not gonna keep them in a classroom. That's the whole point, is that they haven't been successful or they haven't experienced success there. And so I wanna change the way that looks. And so we leave we have a classroom, that's a meeting place, that's where we check in at the beginning of the day, and then we try to be out of there. We do a lot of activities near the school, so we don't have to be on the bus all the time, but we really are out of the classroom. The hardest days in that program are days when I'm not there, and the sub doesn't have access to that, and so the kids are stuck in the classroom all day, and I hate those days. I hate preparing for those days. I feel bad for the sub on those days, because I think our kids engage best when they're out of the school building. When they're in the community. Again, in a small town, that's a huge advantage in a small town. So when we go to the fish hatchery, chances are, of the 14 students I have in the alternative education program, probably 10 to 12 of them, their cousin or uncle or mom or dad works at the hatchery. If I go to one of the orchards, they have a relative who works at the orchard. So they're not just out, it's a job shadow, right? They're seeing what professions are available in the area, but they're interacting with people that they know, which makes a huge difference. I have so much better luck when I have people from the community talk to my students than when I tell them the same thing, right? It's like us as parents too, right? The kids don't listen to me necessarily as a classroom teacher if I'm preaching to them, but when they have a community elder talking to them, telling them the same things, they listen intently. And so that's a huge advantage, to be able to get them out to do those things. And then we try to do that as much as possible in chemistry and physics also, while at the same time trying to make those classes be the college prep classes that they need to be. But we try to incorporate place into chemistry and physics. So for example, in chemistry, coming up as soon as we get back from spring break, we'll be starting a lab activity that will take parts of class for the next several weeks, where they're doing a traditional Western science chemistry lab investigation, but it has to do with chaga, which is a fungus that grows on birch trees that has, a lot of people think it has very strong medicinal value. And so we design an experiment around chaga so that it's a place-based, locally important resource, but has this traditional Western science experimentation flair that goes with it. So bringing kids out is super important, I think. And I don't know, like I said, I could go on and on. It's all about place, to me, it's all about place-based. Oh, one last thing. Lori cuts me off often. I don't know if you saw that, but I did. Anyway, I think respectfully, yeah. And this is a real important, especially because there are a lot of students here in education. This is really important, I think. When I moved from the Twin Cities to Bayfield, and I like to get students involved in competitions. I like that there's something besides me driving what they're doing. And so we do Rube Goldberg contests and toothpick bridge building contests, but I also mentor kids on independent science research for science symposium and science fairs. And when I first started doing that, and we would go to the competitions like in Madison or Milwaukee and beyond, my first response was, my kids don't stand a chance, because these are kids who are going to university laboratories and they're getting mentored and they have these summer internships, and we don't have access to that in Bayfield. But it didn't take me long, and part of this is my competitiveness also. It's like, but wait a minute. We've got things that they don't have in Bayfield, and every rural area has different things that they have access to. And so instead of complaining about not having access to medical labs and universities, we got involved with the hatcheries. We had the hatchery people get involved with, like, what kinds of things would you like to know that you don't know right now? And kids started working on those types of projects. So embrace where you are. If you're in an egg community, embrace the egg community. If you're in a Lake Superior, Great Lakes area, embrace that. So embrace whatever you have available to you.
That was a perfect segue to what I was going to say. So that's very good, Rick. Yeah, I was just going to say, for all my future teachers out there, you know, every community has something cool in it. And don't say you don't, you just haven't looked hard enough. Every single one of your communities has something that makes your community unique and special. And the magic is trying to figure out what that thing is and getting your kids excited about that. Because if you demonstrate you're excited about the history of Cuba City, your kids will be excited about the history of Cuba City, right? And if you don't know what those resources are, ask. I mean, when I first moved here, one of my first stops was up at the Mining Museum because I had moved here. I didn't know much about mining, but I knew that was a big part of the history here. Let's engage the students in conversations about what is going on and what the past was, because the stories of today are built on the stories of the past, right? And so getting your kids to understand the stories that are not only being told, but whose stories are we missing? Getting them to really think critically about whose narratives are there and why aren't other ones there, I think is a great thing too. And if it's not even something like that, I think, gosh, in this area, November should be hunting month, right? You should be talking about, in your elementary classrooms, deer populations, and why do we have so many deer in this area? And then how do different groups hunt? And what's the purpose of a deer camp? And maybe we can have conversations about how do we learn to debate each other? Because some people don't believe in hunting, right? So like, how do we have respectful conversations with each other? There's ways that you can engage your students in what's happening in their real lives in every single one of the content areas. It's just gonna take a little effort because sometimes we're the fish swimming in our own water and we forget that there's cool things in our communities, right? It's just like, yeah, well, I just live here. Yeah, but you've got a really cool history as well. You know, this area is robust. We've got beautiful land and, populations of folks. When I hear students say, well, I don't know what I would do in place-based in my town, it's like, well, you haven't looked hard enough yet, right? And I will tell you, there is an older population living in your town that is dying to tell their stories to you and your students. So I would start there as well.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, I think final question for our panel. I'm actually going to pose it from two different directions. You can decide which one you want to take. We're in a room tonight, I think, of people defined as young professionals that may be looking to move and begin their career in communities, and we also have community leaders in this same space. What advice, panelists, do you have for either or both groups for getting involved for the young ones looking to join a community, and for community leaders, how do you ease that transition for those newcomers that may be moving into your schools or communities?
Okay. And I'll speak from personal experience. So when I first moved to Platteville, I didn't know anybody, and I don't mean to put Lindsay on the spot here, but I would say find what we call in the research, your cultural attaché, which really means find an insider in the community to become friends with and then latch yourself onto them. Just kind of kidding. But I will say Lindsay was so helpful to me because when I first moved here, we were work colleagues, but she was like, do you like to bike? So then all of a sudden we're out and I'm on all the back roads biking, and then there's something over at the library. Do you want to go to that? And then next thing I know, we're getting our pictures taken and we're dressed up. And she introduced me to so many people, which then led me to meet more people, right? And then they'd be the people that I would see in the grocery store and be like, oh yeah, I remember meeting you at this event, or I would see them in the schools and then the parents of the students or they're one of the teachers. And I just feel like finding somebody that is willing to kind of be the person that helps you, because sometimes if you're an outsider, it can feel kind of challenging sometimes if you're the new person in the small town because everybody else knows each other in the small town, right? So sometimes you need those folks that are willing to kind of help extend a hand and help you meet people, and then you from there take that and build out. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. It's as the newcomer coming in, it's very important to first be a listener, like I described earlier, right? You want to learn about the community, allow that information to come to you, but you also want to engage, and sometimes that's easier said than done, right? So because you might not really know what to engage in, or are you welcome? I know we deal with people who come to Bayfield who ask the question like, am I welcome to go to a powwow? And so those are great questions, and so don't hesitate to ask those questions. You shouldn't be embarrassed to ask those kinds of questions. So ask those kinds of questions. Is this something that I can do? Is it open to the public? So yes, engage for sure. Engage in community things. Engage in school events. One of the huge advantages to educators is that when you move into a community, you immediately have access to a huge population. You are educating the children of that community. Their families are engaged. They want to know who you are, as opposed to somebody who's moving in for maybe a retail job who doesn't have that same network. So use that network. So you do want to engage in school and engage in community. And then I'm going to echo what Jen said about for the people who have newcomers come into their community, it's super important to help them engage, and not just with a general invitation, like, hey, we're going to have a cookout. You're welcome to come if you want to. That's cool, but oftentimes people don't necessarily feel comfortable. It should be more like, hey, we're going to have a cookout. I'm coming to pick you up at 6, right? You need to actively engage them and help them to become engaged in the community so that they can, after being at a couple of events like that, get to know more people and at least start to be recognized around the community. So that engagement piece is just super important from both the newcomer's perspective and the people who are there trying to welcome that newcomer.
They both said it wonderfully. I really don't have anything else to say, but it was just amazing what they were talking about.
Well, thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause for Ben Winchester, our keynote speaker, Jen Collins, Rick Erickson, and Frank King. Thank you. This was an amazing dialogue, and we hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.